My name is Robert Miller. Not that it matters much now, I suppose. Names feel like flimsy things. Labels we slap on ourselves to pretend we have some kind of permanence in a world that delights in reminding us how temporary we really are. Right now, though, what matters is the job. Or maybe what matters is surviving the job. Let's be honest, I took the gig because I was broke. Capital B broke. Discovered why. The kind of broke where you start eyeing the dusty cans at the back of the pantry with genuine culinary interest. My last venture, a misguided attempt at artisanal pickle making, had soared faster than cheap milk in July, leaving me with a basement full of brine and a bank account drier than the Sahara. So, when the ad popped up online, night security officer needed, Ashton Museum of Historical Oddities, competitive pay, minimal experience required. I jumped on it like a starving dog on a dropped steak. Competitive pay turned out to be slightly above minimum wage, and minimal experience meant, can you stay awake and call 911 if the place burns down? Still, it was something. Rent wasn't going to pay itself, and my landlord, Mr. Henderson, had started giving me looks that suggested imminent eviction, possibly involving a trebuchet. The Ashton Museum wasn't exactly the Met, tucked away on a less than fashionable street downtown, sandwiched between a bail bonds office and a perpetually closing laundromat. It looked tired. Faded brickwork, grimy windows, why, and a general air of forgotten grandeur clung to it like cheap cologne. During the day, I imagine it had a certain dusty charm, attracting the occasional bored tourist or school group on a budget field trip. But at night, locking myself in after the last daytime staff member scurried out, the place took on a different character entirely. It wasn't a bad museum, just odd. Hence the name, I guess. Historical Oddities. It was less curated collection, more eccentric hoarder's attic, given delusions of academic legitimacy. Glass cases held assemblages that defied easy categorization, chipped porcelain dolls with unnervingly lifelike eyes staring out from miniature wicker chairs, a poorly stuffed taxidermy animals frozen in poses of perpetual surprise or agony, tarnished silverware allegedly used at seances, a collection of Victorian morning jewelry woven from human hair, even a display labeled cursed artifacts, handle with care. Just kidding. Mostly featuring things like a chipped wooden mask from somewhere vaguely tribal, and a rather sinister-looking music box. One entire wing was dedicated to local legends and lore, filled with blurry photographs of alleged swamp monsters, newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances, and artifacts recovered from houses with tragic histories. The silence was the first thing that got to you. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. Every footstep echoed unnaturally on the worn marble floors. Shadows stretched and pooled in the corners, cast by the low emergency lighting, making familiar shapes seem alien and menacing. You constantly felt like you were being watched. The collective gaze of 1,000 dead eyes, glass, painted, or taxidermied, following your progress down the long, dim corridors. It was the kind of place where your imagination could really run wild if you let it. And I, needing this job, was determined not to let it. My orientation was brief. Discovered why. Conducted by a man named Henderson, no relation to my landlord. Thankfully, though, he shared the same air of weary resignation. He looked like he hadn't had a good night's sleep since the Carter administration. He showed me the patrol routes, the location of the fuse box, the ancient-looking CCTV monitor that only covered the main entrance and gift shop. More for show, really. He'd mumbled. And the logbook I needed to sign every hour. Standard stuff. Then, just as he was about to leave, he handed me a slightly greasy, laminated sheet of paper pulled from a battered ring binder. Right, he sighed, rubbing his temples. The list, almost forgot. Just follow these. Don't ask why. Management's peculiar. I took the sheet. It was titled, simply, Night Shift Procedures and Rules. My eyes scanned the typed list. 1. Standard patrol routes must be completed hourly, log entry required. Okay, normal. 2. Ensure all external doors and windows are secure upon shift commencement and remain so. Makes sense. 3. Between the hours of 2000 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. Under no circumstances are you to the Victorian childhood. Exhibit West Wing, 2nd floor. Ensure the door remains closed and locked during this period. Do not respond to any sounds potentially emanating from within. Wait. What for? All lights in the Maritime Disasters Hall. East Wing. Ground floor must remain OF between midnight and 4000 a.m., regardless of perceived electrical faults. 5. If the grandfather clock in the main hall chimes more than once at 300 a.m., proceed immediately to the security office and remain there until 305 a.m. Do not look out the office window. 6. The north wing stairwell is off limits after 100 a.m. Use the main staircase or elevator only. 7. If you hear whistling, specifically a tune resembling O Susanna emanating from the east wing after 3 a.m., immediately turn on all lights in the west wing gallery using the main panel in the security office. Do not investigate the source of the whistling. The lights must remain on until sunrise. 8. Coffee machine in the break room is functional. The toaster, however, is temperamental. Use at own risk. Helpful. 9. Any spills, biological or otherwise, in the local legends exhibit must be cleaned using Kit B. Under sink, janitor's closet, only. Do not use standard cleaning supplies. 10. Do not make eye contact with the reflections in the display cases of the Gilded Age Artifacts room for longer than 5 seconds. 11. Never look directly at the eyes of the mourning bride. Mannequin, West Wing, 2nd floor, adjacent to Victorian childhood. After midnight. Peripheral glances are unavoidable, but direct eye contact is strongly discouraged. 12. Report any unusual activity in the logbook, but refrain from speculation. 13. If the antique phonograph in the Gilded Age parlor exhibit, main floor, begins playing on its own, allow the recording to finish completely. Do not attempt to stop it or unplug the device. 14. Enjoy the quiet. I stared at the list, then back at Henderson's tired face. This had to be a joke. Hazing for the new guy. Some elaborate prank cooked up by bored employees. Right, I said, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. Got it. No whistling investigations. Avoid the creepy doll room at 2 a.m. Let the ghost DJ spin his tunes. Crystal clear. A Henderson just gave me a look that wasn't amused, just flat. Just follow the list, Miller. Easiest way to get through the night. He clapped me weakly on the shoulder and left, the heavy front door sighing shut behind him, the locks clicking with unnerving finality. So there I was, alone in the Ashton Museum of Historical Oddities, armed with a fading flashlight, a logbook, and a list of rules that sounded like they'd been cribbed from a low-budget horror movie. The inherent absurdity of it all was the first layer of defense against any real fear. It was just silly. Management eccentricity, like Henderson said. Probably some insurance thing. Or maybe the old building had weird electrical quirks and drafts that spooked previous guards into quitting. My first few hours were uneventful. I did my patrols, the silence broken only by the squeak of my own shoes and the hum of the ancient heating system. I dutifully signed the logbook. I drank the questionable coffee from the break room. Rule 8 seemed sound advice on the toaster, which looked like it had survived a fire. I tried not to linger too long near the taxidermy badger, whose expression suggested profound existential angst. Midnight rolled around. I made a point of walking past the morning bride, on my next patrol. She stood in a dusty glass case, clad in yellowing lace, a veil obscuring most of her face. Still, you could see the painted eyes. I deliberately avoided looking directly at them. Rule 11. Feeling a ridiculous flicker up something. Caution. Compliance. It was stupid. Just a mannequin. But Henderson's flat expression stuck with me. Later, maybe around 1:30 a.m., I was walking down the long corridor of the East Wing. It was colder here. The air felt heavier. I passed the darkened Maritime Disters Hall, Rule 4 dutifully observed. And then I heard it. Faint, almost subliminal at first. Whistling. My blood went cold. It wasn't, oh, Susanna. Not yet. Anyway, it was just a tuneless, breathy sound, like someone absent-mindedly whistling through their teeth far down the hall. It could have been the wind outside, a draft in the ventilation system, anything. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. This place was old. Old buildings made noises. But it was after midnight. And it was whistling. And Rule 7 flashed in my mind, bright and insistent. If you hear whistling after 3G33 and it wasn't 33 am yet. So, the rule didn't apply. Right? I kept walking faster now, my hand gripping the heavy flashlight tighter. The whistling faded behind me, or maybe it stopped. I couldn't be sure. But the feeling of being watched, which had been a low hum all night, suddenly intensified, prickling the back of my neck. It felt concentrated, emanating from the darkened halls I'd just left behind. I reached the security office, heart hammering against my ribs. I sat down, staring at the grainy CCTV monitor showing the empty entrance. It was nothing. A draft. My imagination, fueled by lack of sleep and that ridiculous list. But as I sat there, the silence pressing in, I found myself pulling out the laminated sheet again. My fingers traced the words of Rule 7, then Rule 11, then Rule 3. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping knot of unease in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it wasn't just a prank. The thought, unwelcome and chilling, settled over me like the museum dust. What the hell had I gotten myself into? The whistling incident, brief as it was, had irrevocably shifted something inside me. The flimsy shield of amused disbelief I'd held up against the list of rules crumbled, leaving raw nerves exposed to the museum's oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't just an old building making noises anymore. It felt intentional. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged, expectant. Every creak of the floorboards, every side of the ancient ventilation system seemed amplified, carrying potential threats. My flashlight beam, which earlier felt like a tool of exploration, now felt like a flimsy defense, pushing back a darkness that felt alive and watchful. I forced myself to continue the patrols, sticking rigidly to the schedule Henderson had laid out. My route took me back towards the West Wing, as the clock ticked closer to 200 a.m. The second floor housed some of the museum's more unsettling exhibits, the aforementioned Morning Bride mannequin, whose eyes I studiously avoided. A collection of antique surgical tools that looked disturbingly well used, and the Victorian childhood exhibit. Rule A3, between the hours of 2:00 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. Under no circumstances are you to enter the Victorian childhood exhibit. West Wing, second floor. Ensure the door remains closed and locked during this period. Do not respond to any sounds potentially emanating from within. As I approached the landing, the air grew noticeably colder. A clammy chill that had nothing to do with the building's faulty heating. The corridor leading to the exhibit was dimmer than the others, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows from display cases filled with porcelain dolls and antique rocking horses frozen mid-rock. The door to the Victorian childhood exhibit was heady oak, dark and imposing. I checked my watch, 1:58 a.m. My hand was on the doorknob, checking the lock as instructed, when I heard it. Faintly, muffled by the thick wood, came the unmistakable sound of a child's giggle. Ice shot through my veins. It wasn't malicious, not exactly, but it was profoundly wrong. It sounded distant, yet intimately close, echoing in the dead space of the museum night. My first instinct, born of years of mundane normalcy, was to investigate. Was a kid somehow locked in? Had someone broken in? But the rules screamed in my mind. Under no circumstances are you to enter. Do not respond to any sounds. Henderson's tired, dead serious face flashed before my eyes. This wasn't a prank. The conviction hit me with the force of a physical blow. These rules weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions. The giggling came again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thudding, like a small ball bouncing gently on a wooden floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, but the rules demanded I stay, ensure the door remained locked, and ignore it. It felt like ignoring a rattlesnake coil at my feet. I forced my hand to remain steady, confirming the lock was engaged. The metal felt unnaturally cold. Then, I turned my back on the door, the sound seeming to claw at my retreating form. I walked, stiff-legged and robotic, down the corridor, not stopping until I reached the main staircase. I didn't look back. The sounds faded, swallowed by the museum's heavy silence. But the feeling of tiny, unseen eyes watching me persisted long after. Signing the logbook at 2:00 a.m., my hand trembled, smudging the ink. The hour between 2:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every reflection in the glass cases held a fleeting, distorted image just beyond the periphery of my vision. I found myself glancing nervously at the gilded age artifacts room, remembering Rule 10. Do not make eye contact with the reflections in the display cases for longer than 5 seconds. I hurried past, my gaze fixed firmly on the floor. Why? The museum no longer felt like a collection of objects. It felt like a collection of presences, waiting patiently in the dark. My patrol route dictated I pass through the main hall around 3:00 a.m. Dominating the cavernous space was a massive grandfather clock, easily 12 feet tall, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the low light. It hadn't chimed all night, and I'd assumed it was merely decorative, another piece of historical junk. Rule A5. If the grandfather clock in the main hall chimes more than once at 3:00 a.m., proceed immediately to the security office and remain there until 3:05 a.m. Do not look out the office window. As the minute hand on my own watch clicked over to 3:00 a.m., a low, resonant gong echoed through the hall, startling me despite myself. It was deep, sonorous, vibrating in the still air. One chime. Okay. Normal. Maybe it only chimed on the hour. Then, impossibly, it chimed again. Gong. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. 2 chimes. The rule. More than once. I didn't wait for a third. I turned and sprinted, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the vast hall. The security office felt miles away. I fumbled with the keycard, my hands shaking, adrenaline flooding my system. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The clock chimed a third time, the sound fainter now, but no less menacing. I scrambled to the desk, collapsing into the worn chair. The CCTV monitor showed the empty entrance hall, bathed in the eerie green glow of the night vision camera. My eyes darted to the office window, which overlooked a small, overgrown courtyard I hadn't paid much attention to before. The rule was explicit. Do not look out the office window. The urge was almost overwhelming. What was out there? Why couldn't I look? Was something connected to the clock? Was it watching the window? I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on my breathing, counting the seconds. It felt like an eternity. 3:03:02. The silence in the office was absolute, contrasting sharply with the frantic pounding of my own heart. 303:03:04. What would happen if I looked? Would I see something staring back? Would looking invite it in? 305 a.m. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The immediate danger, according to the rules, had passed, but the fear lingered, thick and cloying. The incident cemented it. I was playing a game with rules I didn't understand against an opponent I couldn't see, and the stakes felt terrifyingly high. The next half hour passed in a blur of heightened anxiety. I jumped at every noise. Then, at 3:34 a.m., it started again. Whistling. This time, there was no mistaking it. Clear as a bell, echoing from the direction of the east wing, someone or something was whistling Susanna. It wasn't tuneless like before. It was a cheerful, jaunty melody that sounded utterly grotesque in the dead silence of the museum. Rule 7. If you hear whistling, specifically a tune resembling O Susanna, emanating from the east wing after 3:33 a.m., immediately turn on all lights in the west wing gallery using the main panel in the security office. Do not investigate the source of the whistling. The lights must remain on until sunrise. There was no hesitation this time. Pure, instinctual fear propelled me back towards the security office I had just forced myself to leave. The whistling continued, seemingly pacing me, echoing down the marble corridors. It felt playful, almost mocking, and utterly predatory. Do not investigate. The words hammered in my brain. I burst back into the office, heart pounding, fumbling for the main light panel Henderson had pointed out. It was a complex board with dozens of switches. My eyes scanned frantically for the West Wing gallery controls. The whistling seemed louder now, closer, as if it was right outside the office door. I found the bank of switches labeled West Wing gallery lights, main, and slammed them all upwards. Through the small window in the office door, not the forbidden courtyard window, I saw the distant corridor leading to the West Wing suddenly blaze with bright, sterile light, chasing away the deep shadows. The whistling stopped. Instantly. The abrupt silence was almost as jarring as the sound itself. I stood there, trembling, bathed in the artificial glow spilling from the monitor and the distant West Wing. The East Wing remained plunged in darkness, a stark contrast. Whatever had been Weena whistling, Oh Susanna was presumably still there, somewhere in the unlit halls. And according to the rules, I had just annoyed it, warned it off, done something that made it stop. I sank back into the chair, pulling the laminated list out again, my lifeline. Several rules dealt with specific times, now past. Others, like avoiding eye contact with the bride or the reflections, were ongoing concerns. Rule 9 about cleaning spills with Kit B. Rule 13 about the phonographic. They floated ominously in my mind. Sunrise felt impossibly far away. The museum was quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the loaded silence of a predator pausing, waiting. The lights in the West Wing hummed. A small island of artificial safety in a sea of encroaching dread. I was trapped in this place until morning, armed only with a flashlight, a set of bizarre instructions, and the chilling certainty that I was not alone. The rules had saved me so far. But how many more would I have to follow before the night was over? And what would happen if I made a mistake? The silence that descended after I threw the West Wing light switches was somehow worse than the whistling had been. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, thick with anticipation. The bright, sterile lights humming in the distant gallery felt less like a victory and more like I just poked a sleeping beast with a very short stick. Whatever lurked in the East Wing darkness was still there, unseen, unheard, but undeniably present. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, a constant, low-level hum of unseen attention that spiked every time a floorboard creaked, or the ancient building settled. The rest of my patrol route felt like navigating a minefield. Every shadow seemed deeper, every reflection in the polished glass of the display cases seemed to hold a fleeting movement, just at the edge of my vision. I found myself rigidly adhering to rule at 10, counting the seconds under my breath whenever I passed the Gilded Age Artifacts room, jerking my gaze away before the 5-second limit, convinced I'd see something looking back if I lingered even a fraction too long. The mourning bride mannequin, Rule 11, seemed to loom larger in her case, her veiled face somehow more accusatory in the ambient light spilling from the now illuminated West Wing. I hurried past, my eyes fixed on the opposite wall. The simple act of not looking requiring an almost painful amount of concentration. My nerves were shot. Lack of sleep, the constant low-grade fear, and the sheer absurdity of the rules were grinding me down. Was I imagining things? Was the stress making me paranoid? A part of me desperately wanted to believe that, to dismiss the giggling child, the extra chimes, the whistling, as products of an overtired mind in a creepy old building. But the cold certainty that had settled in my gut after the clock incident refused to budge. This was real, the rules were real, and the danger was real. Around 4:30 a.m., my route took me past the Gilded Age Parlor exhibit on the main floor. It was a meticulous recreation of a wealthy family's sitting room from the late 19th century. Velvet settees, heavy drapes, portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and in the corner, an antique phonograph with a large brass horn. It hadn't made a sound all night. Until now. With a soft click and a wearing groan, the phonograph sputtered to life. A scratchy, tinny melody began to drift through the silent hall, a melancholic waltz, warped and distorted by time and whatever unseen force was playing it. Rule 13G. If the antique phonograph in the Gilded Age Parlor exhibit floor begins playing on its own, allow the recording to finish completely. Do not attempt to stop it or unplug the device. My first instinct was to yank the plug, silence the unnerving music. But the rules held me fast. I stood frozen just outside the exhibit ropes, forced to listen as the ghostly waltz echoed around me. It wasn't just sad, it felt wrong. There was an undercurrent of something despairing, almost agonizing, woven into the melody. It scraped along my nerves, each note amplifying the sense of dread that permeated the museum. I couldn't leave. I couldn't interfere. I just had to stand there. A captive audience for a spectral performance, while the minutes stretched into an eternity. The music finally wound, with a series of pathetic clicks and scratches, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. I practically ran to the security office, needing the relative and possibly illusory safety of its four walls. Just before 5:00 a.m., needing to complete my final patrol before the first hint of dawn, I ventured into the local legends and lore wing. This was, arguably, the creepiest part of the museum, even without specific rules attached. Blurry photos of things that shouldn't exist, rusty tools found at sites of tragedy, folk art depicting unsettling local myths. The air here felt stagnant, thick with the weight of forgotten stories and lingering fear. As I rounded a corner displaying artifacts from the infamous Boggy Creek disappearances, I stopped dead. Pooling on the floor beneath a display case holding a gnarled piece of driftwood, vaguely resembling a screaming face, was a dark, viscous puddle. It wasn't water. It was thick, almost black, and shimmered faintly in my flashlight beam with an oily iridescence. A faint, coppery, vaguely metallic smell hung in the air. Rule A9. Any spills, biological or otherwise, in the local Legends exhibit must be cleaned using Kit B. Under sink, janitor's closet only. Do not use standard cleaning supplies. My stomach churned. Biological or otherwise. What the hell was this stuff? It looked disturbingly like old blood, but thicker. Stranger. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to backtrack to the janitor's closet near the main hall. Under the sink, behind the normal bottles of bleach and floor cleaner, was a small, locked metal box labeled simply Kit B. Henderson hadn't given me a key for this. Panic flared briefly before I noticed a small, tarnished silver key taped discreetly to the underside of the sink pipe. Inside Kit B were items that made no sense for cleaning a small, tarnished silver trowel, a thick pair of rubber gloves that felt unnaturally cold. Why? A bottle of clear liquid labeled only with a strange symbol I didn't recognize, a handful of coarse, grayish powder that smelled faintly of ozone, and a roll of thick, black canvas strips instead of paper towels. No instructions. Following the rule meant using only this kit. With trembling hands, I pulled on the icy gloves. The trowel felt heavy wrong. I returned to the spill, the silence of the museum pressing in, amplifying the squelching sound as I scraped the thick lid onto the trowel and deposited onto the black canvas strips. The clear liquid seemed to dissolve the substance on contact, releasing a brief puff of acrid smoke. The gray powder, when sprinkled over the remaining stain, seemed to absorb it instantly, leaving the floor oddly clean but freezing clean cold to the touch. I bundled the soiled canvas strips and the used powder back into Kit B, locked it, and returned it under the sink, feeling contaminated and deeply unnerved. What kind of spill required tools like that? And what, exactly, had I just cleaned up? As I finished logging the incident, Rule of 120. Report any unusual activity, but refrain from speculation. Easier said than done. The first faint hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky outside the main entrance windows. Dawn. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I'd made it. I'd followed the rules, survived the whistling, the clock, the giggling, the music, the spill. But as I gathered my things, ready to bolt the second Henderson arrived to relieve me, a new sound reached my ears. It wasn't loud, barely audible over the hum of the lights I'd left blazing in the west wing. It was a faint, rhythmic thump coming from the floor above, specifically from the direction of the west wing, second floor, near the Victorian Childhood exhibit. The Forbidden Time window, 2215 AM, had long passed. Rule A3 shouldn't apply anymore. But the sound, steady, deliberate, like something heavy being patiently dragged across the floor, sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. It wasn't stopping. It was getting closer to the stairwell. Sunrise was minutes away, but suddenly, the night felt far from over. The rules had guided me through the scheduled horrors, the predictable anomalies. But what happened when something new, something off schedule, began? Was this the final test? Or was the museum just getting started? Dawn was breaking. Then, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy upper windows of the main hall, painting pale stripes across the marble floor. Usually, sunrise signifies safety, the end of the night's terrors. But the rhythmic thump, dragging sound from the second floor, West Wing, hadn't stopped. If anything, it seemed louder now, more deliberate, echoing horribly in the vast, awakening space. It was the sound of something heavy, something patient, being pulled across the floorboards, and it was getting closer to the main staircase. My blood ran cold. The rules, my greasy, laminated shield against the museum's madness, offered no guidance here. Rule AK3 applied only between 2G100 and 2G15 AM. Rule 11 warned against looking the mourning bride in the eyes, but said nothing about this. This was off script, unscheduled, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. The established pattern of fear, the predictable anomalies I'd barely survived, felt almost comforting compared to this new, unknown variable. Thump, thump. It reached the top of the grand staircase. I was frozen near the entrance to the local Legends wing. The memory of the viscous spill and Kit B fresh in my mind. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drumbeat against the slow, inexorable rhythm from above. Run. Hide. The security office felt like the only sanctuary, however flimsy. But getting there meant crossing the main hall, directly, in the path of whatever was descending. I backed slowly into the shadows of the local Legends exhibit, pressing myself against a display case filled with alleged cursed artifacts. My flashlight beam trembled, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in time with the thudding. Peeking around the edge, I saw it. It wasn't the mourning bride. It was worse. Emerging from the gloom, at the top of the stairs, was one of the porcelain dolls from the Victorian childhood exhibit. Except it wasn't small anymore. It stood easily 6 feet tall, its porcelain face cracked and crazed, painted eyes wide and staring with malevolent vacancy. Its frilly dress was torn and stained with something dark that looked disturbingly like the spill I'd cleaned up earlier. In one oversized, chipped porcelain hand, it dragged a large, burlap sack that thumped wetly on each step it descended. The sound wasn't dragging. It was the sack hitting each stair on the way down. Thump, 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 it didn't move like a doll. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, head lolling slightly, yet its progress was steady, relentless. It wasn't looking at me, its gaze fixed somewhere straight ahead, but I felt pinned by its presence. A primal fear rooting me to the spot. This was wrong on every conceivable level. Dolls weren't supposed to be 6 feet tall. They weren't supposed to move. They weren't supposed to drag heavy, thudding sacks down museum staircases at dawn. It reached the bottom of the stairs. The main hall fell silent except for the faint hum of the West Wing lights, and the doll's soft, scraping footsteps on the marble. It began to move across the hall, dragging the sack, heading where? Towards the main entrance, towards the security office, towards me. My breath hitched. I couldn't stay here. I had to get to the office, lock the door. Henderson. The police. What would I even tell them? There's a giant, possibly murderous doll dragging a sack across the museum. They'd think I was insane. Maybe I was. Maybe the stress, the lack of sleep. The rules themselves had finally broken me. But the cold terror felt undeniably real. I took a tentative step back, deeper into the exhibit's shadows. The doll paused. Its head swiveled with a faint grinding sound, its vacant eyes sweeping the hall. It hadn't seen me, not yet. It resumed its slow, dragging progress towards the center of the hall. Now or never. I bolted from the exhibit, sprinting across the open floor towards the security office, praying the sound of my pounding feet wouldn't draw its attention. The office door seemed miles away. I fumbled with the keycard, my hands slick with sweat, glancing frantically over my shoulder. The doll had stopped again. It was slowly turning, the sack bumping against its legs, its blank gaze fixing on my retreating form. I slammed the keycard into the reader. The light flashed green, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the deadbolt. I leaned against the door, gasping, heart threatening to explode. Through the small window in the door, I saw the doll, standing motionless in the middle of the main hall, bathed in the weak morning light, just watching the office. The sack lay still at its feet. Then, the sound of keys rattling in the main entrance lock echoed through the hall. Henderson. He was early. The heavy front doors opened, and Henderson shuffled in, looking even more exhausted than the night before. He didn't seem to notice the giant, terrifying doll standing 30 feet away from him. He just sighed. I pulled out the logbook from its slot and began flipping through my shaky entries. The doll turned its head, slowly, deliberately, towards Henderson. Its painted smile seemed to widen. "Mr. Henderson," I screamed through the door, banging on the glass. "Look out! Behind you!" Henderson looked up, not at the doll, but at me, his expression one of weary annoyance. "Keep it down, Miller. Some of us actually want to go home." He glanced vaguely around the hall, his eyes passing right over the doll, without a flicker of recognition, before turning back to the logbook. "Looks like you had a bit of an active one," he mumbled, noting the lights still blazing in the west wing. "Rule 7, huh? Nasty bit of whistling, that one." The doll took a step towards him, dragging its sack. "No, Mr. Henderson! It's right there!" I yelled, pointing frantically. Henderson finally looked properly, following my finger. He stared at the doll for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed again, a sound of infinite tiredness. "Ah, yes. Her. She gets restless sometimes, especially near dawn. Just ignore her, Miller. She usually puts herself away before the day shift arrives." He closed the logbook. "Rule A3 is mostly for the noise, you see. Don't want to disturb the process. Ignore her. Ignore the 6-foot homicidal porcelain nightmare, dragging a body, sized sack across the floor. The doll stopped, seemingly considering Henderson, then slowly turned back towards the West Wing staircase, resuming its slow, dragging ascent. Thump. Thump. The sound receded back into the upper floors. I stared, dumbfounded, my mind reeling. Henderson acted like this was normal. Just another Tuesday at the Ashton Museum of Historical Oddities. He walked over to the security office and unlocked the door from the outside. "All right, Miller. Shift's over. You survived." He didn't sound congratulatory, just stating a fact. "I quit." I choked out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I can't. I won't. Not another night. Not for any amount of money." Henderson just shrugged, unsurprised. "Suit yourself." Drop the keys and logbook on the desk. "Paycheck will be mailed." He didn't try to persuade me. He didn't ask why. He already knew. I stumbled out of the office, dropping the keys with trembling hands. I didn't look back at Henderson. I walked, almost ran, across the main hall, past the spot where the doll had stood. My eyes fixed on the front doors and the blessedly normal street beyond. The morning sun felt warm on my face, but it didn't dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. As I pushed open the heavy doors, I risked one last glance back into the museum's shadowed depths. For a split second, in the reflection of the glass, I thought I saw a flash of yellowing lace, the glint of painted eyes watching me from the top of the stairs. I didn't wait to be sure. I fled into the morning, leaving the Ashton Museum of Historical Oddities and its impossible rules behind. I never went back. I found another job, something mind-numbingly normal. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I hear faint whistling, or the distant chime of a clock striking one too many times. And I check the locks. Twice. Because I learned that some doors are meant to stay closed. Some rules are there for a reason, and some places are just fundamentally wrong. The museum keeps its secrets, guarded by silence, shadows. We soon discovered why, and a list of rules that only hint at the true horrors waiting within its walls. My name is Alex, and I moved into this quiet little suburban town about 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start. A charming, tree-lined street. Friendly waves from folks walking their dogs. The kind of place where kids still ride bikes, unsupervised until dusk. My little house. A fixer-upper I'd poured my savings into, felt like a haven, after the concrete jungle I'd escaped. For the first few weeks, it was perfect. The air was cleaner. The nights were silent save for the crickets, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Then I noticed him. He lived in the house directly across the street. A 2-story, almost aggressively ordinary, looking house with muted gray siding and a perpetually manicured lawn. His name, according to the faded mailbox, was Mr. Silas Blackwood. He was an older gentleman, maybe late 60s or early 70s. With thinning white hair, meticulously combed, and a preference for tweed jackets, even on warmer days. He seemed harmless enough, a fixture of the quiet street. Occasionally seen tending his rose bushes or collecting his mail with a slow, deliberate pace. But there was one thing about Mr. Blackwood that wasn't ordinary. One thing that, over time, began to chip away at the veneer of normalcy in this idyllic little town and settle a cold, heavy stone of unease in my gut. Every single day, without fail, Mr. Silas Blackwood would shut his windows. Not just close them, but firmly latch them. And not just when it was raining, or cold, or windy. No, he did it every single day, regardless of the weather, regardless of the temperature, regardless of anything outwardly apparent. He did it specifically, religiously, before the sun went down. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. It was a beautiful summer evening, the kind where the air is warm and soft and carries the scent of freshly cut grass. I was sitting on my porch swing, a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the long shadows stretch across the street. I saw Mr. Blackwood out in his front yard, admiring his roses. The sun was still a good hour or so from dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Then, he stopped what he was doing, glanced up at the sky as if checking some invisible clock, and with a surprising briskness for a man of his age, he went inside his house. A few moments later, I heard the distinct sounds of windows being closed, one by one. A soft thud, followed by the click of a latch. It started downstairs, moved upstairs, and within perhaps 5 minutes, every single window in his house was shut tight. I remember feeling a faint pang of curiosity. Maybe he had an allergy to evening pollen, or perhaps he was particularly susceptible to drafts. I shrugged it off. Everyone has their quirks, I reasoned. But then I saw it the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It became a ritual. As the late afternoon light began to soften, around the same time, each day, Mr. Blackwood would cease whatever he was doing, whether it was gardening, reading on his porch, or simply sitting in his armchair, visible through his living room window. He would stand up, his movements precise and unhurried, and begin his rounds. Downstairs windows first, living room, dining room, kitchen. Thud. Click, click. Then upstairs bedroom, study, guest room. Thud. Click. He never missed one. Every window, front and back, ground floor and upper floor, secured well before the last rays of sunlight vanished. It wasn't just closing the windows, it was the way he did it. There was a deliberate, almost urgent quality to it, despite his outwardly calm demeanor, as if he were performing a critical task on a strict deadline. His eyes, whenever I happened to catch a glimpse of him during this ritual, held a focused intensity that was absent at other times. They weren't wide with panic, but narrowed with a grim determination. I started to pay attention. I couldn't help it. It was such an unusual behavior, so out of place in this otherwise predictable environment. I found myself glancing at his house as the afternoon wore on, anticipating the familiar sequence of sounds. My neighbors, the friendly folks I'd waved to, didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they never mentioned it. It was like this was just another part of the street's fabric, as normal as Mrs. Gable next door watering her petunias, or the Petersons' dog barking at the mailman. But it wasn't normal. Not to me. The more I observed, the more the simple act of closing windows before sunset transformed in my mind from a harmless eccentricity into something significant. It felt less like a preference and more like a necessity. Like he wasn't just keeping something out, but keeping something safe inside. Or perhaps keeping something in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had a valuable collection he didn't want exposed to the cool evening air. Maybe he had a specific medical condition aggravated by the sunset hours. But none of the explanations felt right. They didn't account for the sheer consistency, the almost ritualistic nature of the act. It wasn't triggered by a change in weather. It was triggered by the position of the sun. As the days shortened and autumn began to paint the trees in fiery colors, the ritual became even more pronounced. The window shutting time crept earlier and earlier, following the sun's retreating schedule. Mr. Blackwood adjusted seamlessly, performing his task with the same unwavering diligence. Now, sometimes in the late afternoon, while the sun was still quite high in the sky, I found myself structuring my own evenings around his habit. I'd be making dinner or reading a book, and I'd glance out the window waiting for Mr. Blackwood to start his rounds. And once I heard the last thud and click, a strange feeling would descend. It wasn't fear, not exactly, not at first. It was more like a profound sense of isolation. His house, so open and seemingly inviting during the day with its pristine windows, reflecting the sunlight, would become a sealed box as dusk approaches. Dark, silent, impenetrable. And the feeling wasn't just about him. It was about the street itself. Once the windows were closed, the friendly, open atmosphere of the daytime seemed to recede with the light, replaced by a stillness that felt heavy and watchful. The shadows deepened, clinging to the corners of houses and under the thick branches of the old oak trees. The sounds of the neighborhood, distant laughter, the hum of traffic, the occasional barking dog seemed to fade, as if muffled by the closing of not just Mr. Blackwood's windows, but the collective justness of the street. One evening, pure nosiness overriding my better judgment, I decided to stay outside longer than usual. I sat on my porch swing, pretending to read, but my eyes were fixed on Mr. Blackwood's house. He completed his window, shutting ritual as usual, the sounds carrying faintly across the street in the twilight quiet. Then, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, and the official sunset, time arrived, something else happened. The lights in Mr. Blackwood's house didn't come on immediately. The house remained dark, a black silhouette against the deepening indigo sky, for a long time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. There was no sign of life inside. No lights, no movement visible through the now reflective glass of the closed windows. It was as if the act of shutting the windows had plunged the house into a temporary state of suspended animation. Then, one by one, lights began to appear. Not the bright, welcoming glow of living room lamps or kitchen overheads. These were different. Dimmer, softer. They appeared in the upstairs windows first, a faint, almost yellowish light. Then downstairs. They cast long, weak rectangles onto his front lawn, barely illuminating the rose bushes that were so vibrant in the daytime. The quality of the light was what struck me. It wasn't electric light as I knew it. It had a flickering, uneven quality, like gaslight, or perhaps candlelight. And it was weak, as if trying not to escape the confines of the house. It felt ancient, out of place. It didn't chase away the shadows. It seemed to coexist with them, creating new, dancing ones within the rooms I could only partially glimpse. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the mild evening air. This wasn't just a quirk. This wasn't just an old man's habit. This was something else, something deliberate, something protective, or perhaps something fearful. What was Mr. Blackwood so afraid of that he had to seal his house away from the sunset every single day? What came out when the sun went down that required such extreme measures? The questions gnawed at me. They followed me inside my own house as darkness fully fell. I found myself checking my own windows, a new, irrational urge to make sure they were locked creeping in. I dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of focusing too much on my neighbor's odd behavior. But the feeling lingered. The stillness outside felt different now. It felt expectant. Over the next few weeks, my initial curiosity morphed into a low, great obsession. I found myself timing his window, shutting ritual, comparing it to the official sunset time. He was always finished before the sun touched the horizon. Sometimes with minutes to spare, sometimes just barely making it, but always before. I started watching his house more closely after the windows were closed. I'd see those strange, dim lights moving behind the glass, sometimes seemingly lingering in one room for a long time before moving to another. I tried to make out shapes, figures, anything that might explain what he was doing there during the hours of darkness. But the light was too faint, the reflections on the glass too strong. All I could see were distorted blurs and the occasional suggestion of movement that could easily be my imagination. The quiet of the street at night, which I had initially found so peaceful, now felt oppressive. It was a silence that felt enforced, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath. The usual evening sounds seemed muted, distant. Even the crickets, which had been a constant chorus, seemed to quiet down earlier than usual, their chirping fading away as the last of the sunlight disappeared. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake listening. Listening for what? I didn't know. But the silence felt pregnant with something unseen. Something waiting just outside the edges of my awareness. I'd picture Mr. Blackwood's sealed house across the street, bathed in those strange, flickering lights, and a knot of anxiety would tighten in my stomach. What was he doing in there? What was he protecting himself from? The rational part of my brain screamed that this was ridiculous. He was just an old man with a peculiar habit. Maybe he had sensitive eyes, or maybe he was just incredibly set in his ways. But the other part, the part that felt the cold weight of the evening silence and saw the deliberate, almost desperate way he secured his home, whispered something else. It whispered that there was a reason, a dark, unsettling reason. I considered talking to him, just a casual, Hey, Mr. Blackwood, beautiful evening. Why do you always close your windows so early? But the thought made my stomach clench. There was something about his demeanor, particularly during his ritual, that discouraged casual intrusion. His focused gaze, the determined set of his jaw, it wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't inviting either. It was the look of a man with a singular, important task, a task he would not be interrupted from. I also considered asking my other neighbors. Had they noticed? Did they know why he did it? But again, what would I say? So, have you guys noticed Mr. Blackwood acts like the apocalypse is coming every time the sun sets? It sounded insane. I didn't want to be the new eccentric on the block, the one who was obsessed with the old man across the street. So I kept watching. I kept observing. And the mystery of Mr. Silas Blackwood and his sunset ritual continued to grow, weaving itself into the fabric of my new life, transforming the quiet peace I had found here into something laced with apprehension and unspoken dread. The sun was still setting, painting the sky with its fleeting beauty, but for me, and I suspected, for Mr. Blackwood, sunset was no longer just the end of the day. It was the beginning of something else. Something that required the world outside to be shut away. Something that lived in the dark. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. The questions were getting louder, the unease deeper. I had to know what was behind those closed windows. What secret Mr. Blackwood was keeping sealed away from the encroaching night. And as the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, the thought of finding out began to fill me with a creeping, terrible sense of dread, but also an irresistible pull. What was out there? What arrived with the setting sun? And why was Mr. Blackwood the only one who seemed to know, and the only one preparing for it? This was my new reality. My quiet, peaceful suburban street, overshadowed by the sealed house across the way and the unsettling knowledge that, when the sun went down, something changed. And I was watching, waiting, and wondering if, one day, I would see what Mr. Blackwood was so desperately trying to keep out. Or worse, what he was keeping in. The darkness was coming, and his windows were always shut before it arrived. The quiet obsession I had developed with Mr. Blackwood's ritual wasn't just consuming my evenings anymore, it was leaching into my days. While I was at work, filing reports or answering emails, a corner of my mind would inevitably drift to the setting sun, calculating how much time was left before Mr. Blackwood would begin his familiar circuit. I'd picture his hands on the latches, the grim set of his jaw. I'd wonder what he was thinking about, what he was preparing for. During those minutes before dusk, the days started to feel less like periods of activity and more like prolonged waits for the inevitable transition into the unsettling quiet of the night. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. I'd lie awake, straining my ears, listening to the profound silence that fell over the street after Mr. Blackwood's final window. Click. Sometimes I heard things, faint scraping sounds from across the street, a low, almost inaudible hum, or what sounded like movement from within the sealed house. But the sounds were always elusive, fading the moment I consciously focused on them, leaving me to question if they were real or just figments of my sleep-deprived imagination. I tried talking to my immediate neighbors, the Gables. They were a lovely elderly couple. Mr. Gable, a retired history teacher, Mrs. Gable, an avid gardener. I approached them casually one afternoon while Mrs. Gable was tending her petunias. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Mrs. Gable?" I started, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, it is, Alex, dear," she replied, smiling warmly. "Good for the flowers." "Yeah, the weather's been great," I continued, steering the conversation slowly. "Say, I've been meaning to ask, you know Mr. Blackwood across the street? Seems like a private sort." Mrs. Gable's smile didn't falter, but a subtle shift occurred. A slight stiffening in her posture, a fractional narrowing of her eyes. "Silas. Yes, he keeps to himself mostly. Been here longer than most of us, I think." "Right?" I pressed gently. "I just noticed. He always seems to shut his windows pretty early. Every day, before the sun goes down. It's just a little unusual, isn't it?" Mrs. Gable paused her watering. She looked across the street at Mr. Blackwood's perfectly ordinary house, currently basking in the late afternoon sun, with its windows wide open, curtains fluttering gently in a non-existent breeze. She blinked slowly. "Oh, that," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, Silas has his routines. He's always been quite particular about his house. Drafts, you know. Keeps the heat in winter. Cool air in summer, I suppose. Saves on the energy bill." It was such a mundane, practical explanation. Too mundane. Too practical. It didn't fit the deliberate, almost ritualistic nature of the act. The timing tied specifically to the sunset. It didn't explain the strange, dim lights, the deep silence after dark. But Mrs. Gable said it with such an air of finality, as if this was the accepted, unquestionable reason, that I felt immediately shut down. "Right. Drafts?" I mumbled, feeling foolish. "Makes sense." Mr. Gable, who had emerged from the house with a cup of tea, overheard. "Silas. Odd bird, that one. Always has been. Doesn't hurt anyone, though. Just minds his own business." He took a sip of his tea, dismissing the topic entirely. It was clear they either genuinely didn't see it as strange, or they actively chose not to. Was I the only one who noticed? Or the only one who cared? The conversation left me feeling more isolated in my observation than before. The neighborhood wasn't just indifferent. It seemed to have built a collective blind spot around Mr. Blackwood and his sunset ritual. Unable to get answers from the neighbors, I decided I needed to observe more closely. I started spending my evenings after sunset sitting in my living room, lights off, peering through the gaps in my curtains, Mr. Blackwood's house across the street. The house was a dark shape against the night sky. Those faint, yellowish lights appearing in different windows at different times. One night, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I decided to get closer, armed with my phone flashlight, which I kept off and wearing dark clothing. I waited until the street was completely quiet. Well, after Mr. Blackwood would have finished his ritual, The air was cool and still. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light. I crept out my front door, moving quietly across my lawn and onto the sidewalk. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, distorted shadows. Mr. Blackwood's house loomed, darker and more imposing up close. The silence was thicker here, pressing in on me. I crossed the street, staying on the opposite side from his front door, hiding partially behind a large oak tree that offered good cover. From here, I had a slightly better angle on his downstairs windows. The faint yellow light emanated from what I assumed was his living room. I could see the edge of a curtain, but it was thick and opaque, obscuring the interior. I stayed there for a long time, just watching, listening. The only sounds were the distant hum of the town and the blood pounding in my own ears. The air felt colder near his house, a palpable chill that wasn't present on my side of the street. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the air itself was thin, drained of warmth and energy. Then I heard something. It was a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not a moan, but something deep in a chest. It seemed to come from inside the sealed house. It wasn't loud, barely a whisper, but in the absolute stillness of the night, it carried to me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I strained my ears, trying to hear it again, to identify it. Was it Mr. Blackwood? Was he ill? Was he in pain? Or was it something else? The sound was brief, cutting off abruptly, leaving the silence feeling even more profound and terrifying. I waited, tense, for it to return, but it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, a different sound reached me, a faint scrape against wood. It sounded like something being dragged across a floor, slow and heavy. It moved from what I thought was the living room towards the center of the house. My breath hitched in my throat. What was he dragging? And why in the dark? I wanted to run, to sprint back, to the safety of my own house, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I was rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination warring with sheer terror. I kept watching the windows, looking for any sign, any movement, anything to explain the sounds. The yellowish light in the living room shifted, dimming slightly, as if the source of the light was moving or being obscured. Then, for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow flicker behind the thick curtain. Not a human-shaped shadow. It was elongated, jagged, moving with an unnatural speed across the obscured pane. My imagination, sleep deprivation, or something real. The shadow was gone in an instant, leaving only the faint, steady glow. But the image was seared into my mind. An impossible shape, a fleeting horror glimpsed at the edge of vision. I couldn't stay there any longer. The chill and air felt like it was seeping into my bones, and the silence was now thick with a palpable presence. Something unseen and deeply wrong. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the dark house, until I reached the relative safety of my own lawn. I practically ran inside, locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood in the dark living room, pressing my back against the door, listening. The street was silent again. seemingly oblivious to the unsettling activity I had just witnessed or imagined it across the road. Mr. Blackwood's house remained a dark, sealed box, those faint, sickly lights the only sign of life within. That night, I didn't just have trouble sleeping. I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak of my old house, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified, threatening. I kept replaying the low sound, the scraping, the fleeting shadow. My rational mind fought back, trying to conjure logical explanations. Mr. Blackwood was sick. He was moving furniture. I was seeing things in the dark. But the feeling, the gut, deep certainty that something wrong was happening, was impossible to shake. The next day, I saw Mr. Blackwood in his yard, tending his roses as if nothing had happened. He looked the same as always, neat, quiet, deliberate. There was no sign of illness, no exhaustion in his posture, just the same reserved demeanor. He even offered a brief, polite nod as I left for work, his eyes seemingly calm and ordinary. It was jarring. This stark contrast between his daytime appearance and the unsettling reality of his sealed house at night. It was as if he was two different people, or living two different lives, one exposed to the mundane light of day, the other hidden away in the protective darkness behind locked windows. The routine continued, day after day. The sun would begin its descent. Mr. Blackwood would start his rounds, sealing his house away from the encroaching night. And I would watch, feeling that familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I tried searching online. Neighbors with strange habits, people who fear sunset, unexplained sounds at night suburban. The results were predictably unhelpful. Forums discussing annoying neighbors, articles about sundown syndrome in dementia patients, ghost stories that felt too theatrical compared to the subtle, pervasive dread I was experiencing. There was nothing that resonated with the specific, methodical ritual of shutting windows before sunset, tied to those dim, strange lights and the unsettling sounds within. I started thinking about the history of the street, of the town. Had anything strange ever happened here? Any old legends? Any unexplained events? I couldn't find anything online, but perhaps the local library or historical society might have information. It felt like a long shot, but the need to understand was becoming unbearable. The feeling of being the only one aware of this growing darkness was the worst part. It was like living in a horror movie, where the only character who sees the monster, while everyone else goes about their lives, oblivious. Was I going crazy? Was I projecting my own anxieties onto a harmless old man? The doubt was a cruel twist, adding a layer of psychological horror to the external mystery. But the memory of that low sound, the scrape, the shadow, it felt too real to dismiss entirely. It felt like a crack had appeared in the ordinary reality of this street, and I had glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be there. The sun was setting earlier now. The window shutting ritual started earlier, too. The period of sealed, silent darkness in Mr. Blackwood's house was growing longer each day, and with each passing day, my conviction grew. Mr. Blackwood wasn't just protecting himself from drafts. He was protecting himself or perhaps the world, from something that emerged with the absence of light. Something that didn't like the sun. Something that stirred and moved behind locked windows, illuminated by those strange, weak lights. I knew I couldn't just watch forever. The questions were too loud, the unease too potent. I had to find out what was happening. I had to understand why Mr. Blackwood was so afraid of the dark. And I had a terrible feeling that the only way to get answers was to get closer. Much closer. The darkness was coming. And the sealed house across the street felt like the epicenter of a secret the whole neighborhood was ignoring. I was no longer just an observer. I was being drawn in, step by reluctant step, towards the shadows that gathered around Mr. Blackwood's house each night. What would happen when I finally got close enough to see inside? The thought terrified me. But the alternative, living with this knowing uncertainty, felt even worse. The whispers in the dark were calling to me, and I was starting to listen. The whispers in the dark, the scraping sounds, the impossible shadow, they weren't just memories anymore. They were imprinted on my mind, looping constantly, eroding my sense of reality. The line between what I had possibly imagined and what I was certain I had witnessed blurred, leaving me in a constant state of nervous exhaustion. Sleep offered no refuge. My dreams were filled with locked windows, creeping shadows, and the chilling sound of something being dragged across a floor. My job performance started to slip. I was distracted, jumpy. My colleagues noticed. They'd ask if I was feeling all right, if everything was okay at home. I'd offer vague reassurances, forcing a smile, all the while thinking about the angle of the sun outside and how much time was left before the ritual would begin. The outside world, with its mundane concerns of deadlines and meetings, felt increasingly flimsy and irrelevant compared to the dark mystery unfolding across the street every single night. I couldn't approach Mr. Blackwood directly. My failed attempt to discuss it with the Gables had proven that the topic was either taboo or genuinely invisible to my neighbors. They lived in a state of willful ignorance, or perhaps actual ignorance. Was it possible I was the only one with eyes to see, or ears to hear? The thought was terrifying in its isolation. I decided I needed more information, something that wasn't filtered through my own, potentially unreliable senses in the dead of night. The idea of local history. Research from Part 2 resurfaced. I took a sick day from work, telling my boss I had a terrible migraine, not entirely a lie. Instead of staying in bed, I drove to the small town library. It was a quaint, old building, smelling of dust and aged paper. I found the local history section and started digging. I looked through old town records, newspaper archives, local history books. I searched for Mr. Blackwood's name, for the address of his house, for any mention of unusual occurrences on my street, particularly anything related to strange phenomena or unexplained events occurring around sunset or during the night. Most of it was mundane, articles about town council meetings, bake sales, high school football games. There was some history on the older houses, including mine and Mr. Blackwood's. His house, built in the early 1900s, had a simple history, passed down through a couple of families, renovated a few times. No mentions of anything out of the ordinary. Discouraged, I was about to give up when I stumbled upon a small, self-published pamphlet tucked away in the back of the local history section. Its title was faded. Something about local folklore and unexplained tales. It seemed less like formal history and more like collected gossip and old wives' tales. Flipping through it, I found a short, untitled entry under the heading, Sunset Peculiarities. The entry was cryptic and vague, written in a somewhat rambling style. It spoke of the old ways, the thinning veil, and how the boundary between here and elsewhere softens when the light dies. It mentioned risen the sun, ancient hungers, and the need for proper warding when the shadows lengthen. It didn't mention specific locations, old Wayne's locations or names, but the timing when the light dies and when the shadows lengthen resonated chillingly with Mr. Blackwood's ritual. It was written in the language of folklore, not fact, but it sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Could this be what he was preparing for? Some unseen force that emerged at dusk. The pamphlet was frustratingly unspecific. It felt like it was hinting at something vast and terrible without ever naming it. It reinforced the idea of a danger at sunset, but offered no concrete details about what that danger was. Still, it was the first thing I had found that acknowledged the specific timing of the threat. It suggested that this wasn't just Mr. Blackwood's personal delusion. There might be a basis for it in local, albeit obscure, belief. Leaving the library, the sunlight felt less comforting than it had before. It felt temporary, a fragile barrier against whatever was described in that pamphlet. My investigation hit a wall of dead ends. I couldn't find anything else concrete. The only path left was more direct observation. That night, I prepared more carefully. I retrieved an old pair of binoculars from the back of a closet. I waited until the neighborhood was completely dark and silent, the streetlights providing the only illumination. Mr. Blackwood's house was sealed, those dim, yellowish lights glowing faintly in the windows. This time, I didn't stay by the oak tree. I decided to try and get a closer look from the side of his house, where there was a narrow alleyway between his fence and the next property. It was riskier, closer to his windows, but might offer a better angle. Creeping across the street and down the alley, the silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. The air in the alley was even colder than out front, with a strange, stagnant quality to it. It felt heavy, dead. I reached a point where I could see one of his downstairs windows relatively clearly through a gap in the fence and some overgrown bushes. The thick curtain was drawn, but I could see the faint light bleeding around the edges. Carefully, slowly, I raised the binoculars to my eyes, focusing on the gap where the light was strongest. Through the powerful lenses, the view was magnified, sharper. I could see the weave of the thick, dark fabric of the curtain. And then, just through the tiny gap, where it didn't quite meet the window frame, I saw a sliver of the room inside. It was difficult to make out details in the dim, flickering light, but I could see a section of a wall covered in what looked like aged wallpaper with a dark, swirling pattern, and then I saw movement. Not Mr. Blackwood. The movement was low to the ground, slithering or dragging itself just above the floorboards. It was dark, darker than the shadows it moved within. It wasn't a distinct shape, more like a shifting mass of concentrated darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, accompanied by that faint scrape, sound I had heard before. It moved into the sliver of my vision, paused for a moment, and then moved out. It was formless, unnatural. It didn't have limbs or a head, or any discernible features of an animal or person. It was just wrong. A moving patch of absolute blackness in the dim light. My hands trembled, the binoculars shaking slightly. What was that? Was it some kind of large rodent? A weird shadow effect. My rational mind was scrabbling for explanations, but the image of that dark, formless thing dragging itself across the floor was already seared into my memory, overriding logic. I kept watching the gap, my breath held tight in my chest. The dark mass didn't reappear in that specific spot, but I could see the light shifting slightly in the room, suggesting the source of the light, perhaps a lantern or candle, was being moved, following the movement of the dark shape. The scraping sound continued intermittently, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, indicating the thing was moving around the room. There were other sounds now too, wet slithering noises, and occasionally that low, guttural sound again, like a pained sigh or a whisper of raw hunger. It wasn't just happening in one room. As I watched the light and listened, I could hear the sounds moving, sometimes seeming to shift to a different part of the house entirely, though still on the ground floor. It was as if this thing was patrolling the perimeter of the house, moving from room to room, just inside the barrier of the sealed windows. And then I heard Mr. Blackwood. His voice was low, strained, barely audible. He wasn't speaking words, not that I could make out. It was more like a constant murmur, a repetitive chant or prayer. It was steady, unwavering, a counterpoint to the unsettling sounds of the moving darkness. He was accompanying it, perhaps, or trying to ward it away with his quiet incantation. He wasn't interacting with it in a way that suggested communication. His voice sounded wary, resigned, but determined, like someone performing a necessary, albeit horrifying duty. The air around me, in the alley, seemed to grow colder still, the heavy stillness pressing in. It felt like the boundaries described in the pamphlet were thinning right here, right now. I had the terrifying sense that I was too close, that I was trespassing on something ancient and dangerous. Then, without warning, the dim light in the room I was watching suddenly flared, just for a second, casting a brief, sickly yellow glow through the gap in the curtain. In that split second, the dark mass was illuminated more clearly. It was definitely not an animal. It was larger, denser, and its edges seemed to writhe and shift as if made of liquid shadow. And for that fraction of a second, I saw something else within the mass brief. Glinting points of light, like tiny wet eyes reflecting the flare. My gasp was loud in the silent alley. The light snapped back to its previous dimness instantly. The scraping and slithering sounds paused. The air went utterly still. It was as if everything in the house had frozen, listening. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Had they heard me? Had it heard me? I stayed frozen, binoculars still pressed to my eyes, staring at the dark house. The silence, stretched tense and absolute. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. Every instinct screamed at me to run. After what felt like an eternity, the scraping sound resumed, but it was different this time. It was closer to the window, slower, more deliberate. It was moving towards the gap where I was watching. Panic seized me. I didn't hesitate this time. I lowered the binoculars, turned, and stumbled back down the alley as quietly as I could, my eyes fixed on the dark shape of the house. I expected to see a light flick on, to hear a door open, to feel something unseen grabbing at me from the shadows. But nothing happened. I reached the street, crossed it half running, and fumbled with my keys at my own front door. Inside, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My legs were shaking uncontrollably. I hadn't just heard things tonight. I had seen something. Something that defied explanation. Something that belonged in the realm of nightmares. The pamphlet's cryptic warnings suddenly felt terrifyingly real. Things that resent the sun. Yes. That formless darkness that moved in the dark, lit by ancient light, accompanied by sounds of dragging and slithering and guttural whispers. And Mr. Blackwood, chanting, murmuring, keeping vigil. Or is he its captor? Or its guardian? Or just another prisoner, forced to share his home with this entity? Once the sun went down, the questions were still there, but now they were overlaid with a thick layer of sheer horror. I had confirmation. Something was happening across the street. Something was in Mr. Blackwood's house after dark. And it was something that made a grown man meticulously seal every window and spend his nights chanting against the darkness. I looked out my own window at Mr. Blackwood's house. It was still dark, still sealed. The dim lights were still there, faint and unsettling. The silence of the street felt less peaceful than ever before, a thin veneer over a terrifying reality I had just glimpsed. I was no longer just curious. I was terrified. But the terror was mixed with a desperate need to understand, to know what I was dealing with, what my neighbor was dealing with. I had come too close to turn back now. But I also knew, with a chilling certainty, that getting closer was becoming exponentially more dangerous. The darkness had a shape now, however, ill-defined, and it was just across the street, waiting for the sun to set. And perhaps now, it knew I was watching. The sealed windows weren't just keeping something out. They were keeping something in. And I had just peered through a crack in the seal. What would happen when it decided to look back? Seeing that thing was the breaking point. It shattered the last remnants of my rational denial. This wasn't an old man's eccentricity, a medical condition, or an overactive imagination. There was something genuinely, horrifyingly wrong across the street. The dark, formless mass, the slithering sounds, the ancient, flickering light, Mr. Blackwood's wary chanting, it all coalesced into a nightmare reality that I could no longer ignore. The terror I felt was profound and paralyzing. I barely slept for days after. Every shadow in my own house seemed to deepen. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like it came from just outside my door. I found myself checking my own windows constantly, an irrational fear that whatever was in Mr. Blackwood's house could somehow get into mine. Despite my outward efforts to appear normal, I started closing my windows earlier too, not latching them with the same desperate urgency as Mr. Blackwood. But the instinct was there, a seed of his fear taking root in my own mind. Yet, beneath the terror, the desperate need to understand festered. What was that thing? Why was it there? What was Mr. Blackwood doing? Was he fighting it? Containing it? Appeasing it? The cryptic pamphlet hinted at ancient hungers and things that resent the sun, things that emerged when the thinned. Was his house built on a place where this veil was particularly thin? Was Mr. Blackwood a protector or a jailer? The nights became an agonizing vigil. I no longer dared to go into the alley, but I watched from my darkened living room. The binoculars clutched in my hands. The ritual never changed. As the sun began its descent, Mr. Blackwood would meticulously seal his house. The faint yellow lights would appear. The deep, unnatural silence would fall over the street. And I would watch, knowing that behind that sealed facade, the dark mass was moving, slithering, accompanied by those chilling sounds and the low, constant murmur of Mr. Blackwood's voice. The fear was wearing me down, eroding my sanity. I knew I couldn't live like this. I had to do something. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor closes his windows before sunset, and I think he has a formless shadow monster in his house. I'd be laughed at, probably institutionalized. I was on my own. My options felt limited and terrifying. I could try talking to Mr. Blackwood again, perhaps at a time of day when the threat seemed dormant. Or I could try to get undeniable proof, something that would force the authorities, or at least someone, to believe me. The latter seemed impossible without putting myself in immense danger. But the thought of living year after year, knowing what was across the street, watching that house seal itself away from the light, feeling the pervasive dread settle over the neighborhood every night, it was a fate worse than almost any alternative. I decided to try Mr. Blackwood one more time. I would wait until midday, when the sun was high and the entity presumably dormant. I would approach him directly, calmly, and ask him about the windows, about the nights. It was a long shot, but I had to try. The next day I waited. The sun was at its zenith, flooding the street with bright, warm light. Mr. Blackwood was out in his front yard, watering his rose bushes, just as he often was during the day. He looked utterly normal, a harmless old man enjoying the sunshine. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I walked across the street. Mr. Blackwood, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned, his watering can still in his hand. His expression was polite, if a little distant. "Ah, Alex. Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood," I said, trying to sound casual. "Beautiful roses." "Thank you," he replied with a slight smile. "They require diligent care." "I can see that," I said, then paused, searching for the right words. "Mr. Blackwood, I've been meaning to ask you about something. It's about the evenings. Your windows." His smile vanished instantly. His eyes, which had seemed calm moments before, became guarded, wary. "My windows." "Yes," I pressed on, feeling the carefully constructed calmness beginning to fray. "You always close them before sunset." "Every day. I was just curious. It seems like a very strict routine." He put the watering can down slowly. His posture stiffened, becoming rigid. The air between us seemed to grow colder, despite the midday sun. "It is necessary," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "Necessary?" I asked, taking a small step closer. "Why is it necessary, Mr. Blackwood? What are you keeping out? Or keeping in?" His gaze was sharp now, intense. It held a depth of knowledge and wary resignation that chilled me more than any shadow. "Some things," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "do not belong in the light. They belong in the like, and they crave what the light protects." My blood ran cold. "The things from the pamphlet," I blurted out, instantly regretting showing I had been investigating. "The thinning veil. The ancient hungers." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by a deep sadness. "You have been looking," he stated, not as a question, but a weary acknowledgement. "You should not have looked." "What is it, Mr. Blackwood?" I pleaded, lowering my voice. "What is in your house?" He looked past me, down the street, then back at his house. A profound sorrow etched on his features. "It has been here for a long time," he said, his voice heavy with history. "Since before this town was built. This land, it holds a scar, a weakness in the world. And when the sun goes down, the scar opens, and something crosses over." He finally looked back at me, his eyes filled with a terrible knowledge. "It feeds on the light, Alex. Not the light of the sun, but the light within things. Life, warmth, consciousness. The sealed windows, the wards, the chanting, they are a barrier. They keep it contained. Keep it from spreading. Keep it from consuming." "Consuming?" I whispered, horrified. "It grows stronger in the dark," he continued, his voice taking on a low, urgent tone. "The light weakens it, forces it back to the edge. But it is always there, always waiting." He picked up his watering can again, a clear dismissal. "You have seen too much, Alex. You know too much. Forget it. Live your life. And for your own safety, always shut your windows before the sun goes down. And make sure they are latched." He turned back to his roses, his movements deliberate, final. I stood there, stunned into silence, the bright midday sun suddenly feeling utterly inadequate. I wanted to ask more. How did it get there? Why his house? How long had he been doing this? But his posture, his tone, was a clear boundary. He had said what he needed to say, issued his warning. As I walked slowly back across the street, my mind reeled. It was real. All of it. The formless entity, the darkness, the danger tied to sunset. Mr. Blackwood wasn't crazy. He was a sentinel, a guardian of a terrible secret, performing a vital, terrifying duty every single night. The confirmation brought no relief, only a deeper, colder dread. Knowing what the threat was, even vaguely, made it more real, more terrifying. The next few days were the worst. The knowledge sat heavy in my stomach like lead. The sunset ritual across the street became an unbearable countdown to the emergence of that dark, slithering thing. I shut my own windows now, locking them tightly, but it felt like a pathetic gesture compared to the ancient warding Mr. Blackwood was performing. Then, one evening, as the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows, a critical time, just before Mr. Blackwood would normally be finishing his rounds, I heard a sound that wasn't the familiar thud and click. It was a loud, splintering CK. It came from Mr. K. Blackwood's house. My blood ran cold. I rushed to my living room window, peering out. Mr. Blackwood wasn't at his windows. He was standing on his porch, looking up at his house with a look of sheer, unadulterated horror on his face. "Another Shrek!" This time, I saw it. One of the upstairs windows. The glass didn't just break. It seemed to flex inwards, warping like plastic under immense pressure, before shattering outwards in a cascade of glass. Then, the sound started. Not the faint scraping and slithering I had heard before. These were louder, more frantic. A tearing sound like wet fabric ripping. A guttural, echoing roar that was nothing like a human sound. The faint yellow lights inside Mr. Blackwood's house began to flicker wildly. Then one by one, they winked out. Darkness flooded the rooms I could see through the now broken window. Mr. Blackwood stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest. He looked frail, terrified. No longer the determined sentinel, but a man facing an overwhelming horror. More windows began to buckle and break, one after another, the sounds of shattering glass mingling with the hideous noises from within. The dark entity I had glimpsed, or something far worse, was no longer contained. The seal was breaking. I could feel it from across the street. The air grew impossibly cold, a draining, suffocating cold that reached out from the dark house. A heavy, cloying smell, like stagnant water and something rotten, began to drift across the street. And then I saw it. Not through a window this time. It emerged from the jagged, broken opening where the upstairs window had been. A tendril of absolute, consuming darkness. It was thicker than the shadow I had seen before, wreathed with an unnatural energy, and seemed to drink the light from the very air around it. It stretched out tentatively, like a sensing organ, towards the street. Mr. Blackwood let out a choked cry and stumbled back into his house, slamming the door shut behind him. A futile gesture now. My mind went blank with terror. The pamphlet, the ancient hunger, it fed on the light within. The dark tendril retracted back into the broken window for a moment. The horrific sounds inside intensified, followed by a new sound, Mr. Blackwood screaming. A short, choked scream that ended abruptly. Silence. A terrible, absolute silence fell over Mr. Blackwood's house. The sounds from within ceased. The remaining dim lights went out, plunging the house into total darkness. But the cold remained. The foul smell intensified, and the house itself seemed to pulse faintly with a dark, internal energy. Then, slowly, deliberately, the tendril of darkness emerged again from the broken upstairs window. This time, it didn't retract. It hung there for a moment, a living void against the twilight sky, before another tendril and another began to push their way out of the other broken windows. They were reaching out, stretching across the lawn towards the street, towards the other houses, towards my house. I backed away from my window, stumbling over furniture. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The street was still quiet, bathed in the fading light of dusk. Had no one else heard? No one else seen? Were they all inside, living in their ignorant bliss, their windows still open to the encroaching night? I had to get away. I had to leave. But as I fumbled for my keys, my eyes were drawn back to Mr. Blackwood's house. The dark tendrils were lengthening, reaching the edge of his lawn. They seemed to flow like liquid shadow, silent and unstoppable. And then, in the utter darkness of Mr. Blackwood's house, 2 points of faint, sickly yellow light appeared in the upstairs window frame, where the tendril had first emerged. They were low down, close together, like eyes. They seemed to be looking directly at me. I froze, caught in their unseen gaze. The cold intensified, seeping through the walls of my house. The foul smell was stronger now, clinging to the air. Mr. Blackwood's final warning echoed in my mind. It feeds on the light within things. My own lights were on. My windows were shut, but were they latched? Were my seals strong enough? The pamphlet hadn't mentioned mere glass being sufficient. It spoke of warding. The tendrils flowed off Mr. Blackwood's lawn and onto the street, silent and unseen by the few cars that drove past. They moved with a horrifying purpose, dividing and spreading, reaching for the other houses on the street. And the eyes in Mr. Blackwood's dark house remained fixed on me. I knew then that my curiosity had condemned me. I had seen the secret, and now the secret had seen me. Mr. Blackwood's sealed house wasn't just a containment. It was a sacrifice. He was keeping it occupied, keeping it fed, preventing it from looking elsewhere. But now the seal was broken, and it was looking. The last rays of the sun disappeared below the horizon. Total darkness fell. Across the street, Mr. Blackwood's house was a void, save for those two faint, malevolent yellow lights that seemed to bore into my soul. I could hear it now, just outside my walls. A faint scraping, a low, wet slithering. The cold was unbearable. The smell was nauseating. My windows were locked. But I knew, with a bone, deep certainty, that locks wouldn't stop this. Nothing that relied on physical barriers would. The final sound I heard before the fear consumed me entirely was a soft, insistent tap against my living room window. Not the tap of a ranch or rain. It was a deliberate, searching tap, and then another, and another, moving slowly, steadily across the glass. It had found my window. It knew I was inside. The light within me felt like it was flickering, growing weak. The darkness outside pressed in, eager to consume. Mr. Blackwood's house was silent, its duty done, its sacrifice made. The thing he had kept contained was free. And it was at my window tapping, waiting for the light to finally go out. The sunset had come. My windows were shut, but the darkness had arrived anyway. And I was its next target. The end of the street felt very, very far away, and the tapping was getting louder. My name is Alex. I'm 28, live in a pretty standard suburban town a couple of hours outside of a major city on the East Coast. My life is pretty normal, work a desk job, hang out with friends, try to convince myself I should go to the gym more often. The biggest constant in my life, besides my slightly too nosy parents, is my older brother Ben. Ben is 32. We've always been close, typical brothers, fought like hell as kids, became each other's best friends as adults. He's always been the more laid-back one, easygoing to a fault sometimes. Never really had much trouble in the dating department, but he also never seemed to find someone he wanted to settle down with. He'd have relationships that would last a few months, maybe a year, then they'd just end. No big drama, just a quiet fizzling out. He never seemed too broken up about it, which honestly used to worry me a little. I wanted him to find someone who made him genuinely happy, who stuck around. Then, about 3 months ago, he met Sarah. He met her through some online dating app, the kind everyone uses now. He mentioned her casually at first, just, "Hey." Went on a date, she was nice. Then it progressed to going out with Sarah again. And then pretty quickly, she was just around. Like, always around. It wasn't a slow introduction. One week I hadn't even heard her name, the next she was at our parents' house for Sunday dinner, awkwardly smiling and making small talk. My parents, bless their hearts, are usually pretty at making anyone feel welcome. But even they seemed a little reserved around her initially. Not in a mean way, just maybe slightly unsure. And that was my first hint that something was maybe not entirely right. It wasn't anything she did specifically. She's conventionally attractive, polite, quiet. She says the right things, smiles when expected, nods along with conversations. On paper, she's perfect. Ben is clearly smitten, like, really smitten. I haven't seen him this happy, this absorbed by someone, maybe ever. He looks at her like she hung the moon. And that, in itself, is part of the weirdness. Ben has never been one for grand gestures or overly sappy romance. He's a practical guy. But with Sarah, he's different. He's more attentive, almost excessively attentive. Like he's constantly trying to make sure she's okay, constantly seeking her approval or attention. Okay, so let's talk about Sarah herself. What is it that feels off? It's subtle things, initially. Things I tried to brush off as just her being shy, or maybe a little socially awkward. But they've started to accumulate, and now they feel less like quirks and more like deliberate choices. Her eyes. That's the first thing I noticed, subconsciously. They're a really striking pale blue, almost gray. And they're beautiful, objectively. But when she looks at you, it feels less like she's seeing you, and more like she's scanning you. Like she's processing data. There's a flatness to her gaze sometimes, a lack of warmth that doesn't match her polite smile. I've caught her staring, not just at Ben, but at me, at my parents, at objects in the room, with this incredibly intense, unblinking stare. It lasts just a second too long, and it sends a little shiver down my spine. When I try to meet her eye directly, she usually looks away quickly, her smile fixed in place. Then there's her voice. It's soft, almost a whisper sometimes. She speaks in incredibly measured tones, never raises her voice, never uses slang or contractions. It's almost unnervingly formal, like someone who learned English from a textbook and hasn't quite grasped the nuances of casual conversation. But she grew up here, Ben said. She's lived in this state her whole life. It doesn't add up. Sometimes when she's talking, I get the weirdest feeling that she's repeating phrases she's heard elsewhere, rather than expressing her own thoughts. It's like she's mimicking conversation. Her movements are also precise, economical. She doesn't fidget, doesn't make unnecessary gestures. She sits with perfect posture, stands perfectly still. When she walks, it's a smooth, gliding motion. It sounds silly, I know, but try picturing someone who moves like a perfectly programmed robot. Not stiff or jerky, but too smooth too. Controlled. Like every movement has been calculated and rehearsed. It's unsettling. The first time I really felt this strongly was maybe 2 weeks after I first met her. Ben invited me over to his apartment for pizza and a movie. Sarah was there. Of course. We were sitting on the couch, me on one end, Ben in the middle, Sarah on the other end. We were watching some action movie. Explosions and gunfire filling the room. Ben and I were reacting, laughing at the cheesy one-liners, flinching at the loud noises. Sarah just sat there, perfectly still. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, but her expression didn't change. No jump, no laugh, no wince, just watching. It was like she wasn't processing the information emotionally at all. Like she was observing an experiment. During the movie, Ben got up to get more drinks. As soon as he was out of the room, the air in the room seemed to change. It became heavier, quieter, despite the movie still blaring. I glanced over at Sarah. She turned her head very slowly towards me. Her pale eyes met mine, and that blank, scanning look was there. It felt like she was seeing right through me, past the surface level Alex into something deeper, something I didn't want her to see. I felt exposed, vulnerable. And then, just as slowly, discovered why. She turned her head back to the screen. Her expression remained neutral. The entire interaction couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds. But it felt like an eternity. When Ben came back, she was smiling politely again, the moment gone as if it had never happened. But I felt it. I felt the coldness behind the smile. Another incident happened a few weeks later. My parents were having a small backyard BBQ. Ben and Sarah were there. My mom has this really old, slightly beat-up bird bath in the garden. It's been there forever, a little chipped and stained. But she loves it because her grandmother gave it to her. Sarah was standing near it, looking at it with that intense, unblinking stare. My mom went over to talk to her, made some comment about the bird bath and how old it was. Sarah just nodded, her eyes still fixed on it. Then, in that quiet, measured voice, she said, "It requires maintenance to prevent decay." My mom just kind of blinked at her. "Oh, well, yes, I suppose it does," she said, a little awkwardly. "But it's more about the sentimental value, you know." Sarah just gave that polite, empty smile. "Sentiment is a fascinating variable in material preservation," she said. It wasn't just the strange phrasing. It was the way she said it. Like she was reciting a definition from a science textbook. My mom just kind of trailed off the conversation after that. She gave me a look later. A raised eyebrow that clearly said, "Isn't she?" A little odd. Yes, Mom. A little odd is putting it mildly. The weirdness isn't just her behavior, though. It's also how she seems to not interact with the world in a normal way. For instance, she doesn't seem to have any hobbies. When people ask her what she likes to do, she gives vague answers about observing or learning. Learning what? She doesn't read books, doesn't watch TV shows, other than sitting through the ones Ben watches with that blank stare, doesn't listen to music. She doesn't seem to have any friends outside of Ben. Ben says she works from home, some kind of data analysis, but he doesn't seem to know much about it either. It's all very undefined, and her knowledge base is bizarrely inconsistent. Sometimes she seems incredibly knowledgeable about obscure topics, like the tensile strength of different types of metal, or the migratory patterns of birds in a completely different hemisphere. Other times, she seems to lack basic common sense, like not knowing how to boil water, or being genuinely confused by sarcasm. Discovered why. It's like she's downloaded vast amounts of information, but hasn't processed how it applies to everyday life. Then there are the little things that really start to gnaw at you. I was over at Ben's place helping him move some furniture. Sarah was there, sitting quietly on the couch, watching us. At one point, Ben dropped a heavy box on his foot. He yelped, hopping around in pain. I rushed over to see if he was okay. Sarah didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched him, with that same blank, observing gaze. No concern, no empathy, nothing. Ben brushed it off, said he was fine, probably just bruised. But I saw Sarah's reaction, or lack thereof. It was chilling. I tried talking to Ben about it, casually at first. "So, Sarah seems quiet, huh?" Ben just shrugged, smiling. "Yeah, she's a little shy at first, but she's amazing, Alex. You'd really like her if you got to know her." "I'm trying, man," I said. "But she seems a little, I don't know, detached." Ben's smile faltered slightly. She's just introverted," he said, maybe a little too quickly. "Not everyone is as loud and outgoing as you and me." "It's more than that, Ben," I pushed gently. "Doesn't she strike you as a little different?" He sighed. "Look, Alex, she's not like anyone I've ever met. And yeah, maybe she's a little quirky. But she's kind, she's smart, and she makes me happy. Really happy. Can't you just be happy for me?" And that's the thing. I want to be happy for him. He's my brother. His happiness is important to me. But this feels wrong. This doesn't feel like normal happiness. It feels like he's under some kind of spell. Or Maybe he's just so desperate for this relationship to work that he's blind to the weirdness. The weirdness is escalating, though. It's no longer just subtle behavioral quirks. I'm starting to feel predatory. A few nights ago, I was leaving Ben's apartment after visiting. I said goodbye to Ben, and Sarah was standing by the door. As I turned to leave, she reached out and lightly touched my arm. Her hand felt incredibly cold, even through my shirt. She didn't say anything, just gave me that same unblinking stare, that faint, polite smile. It felt like a deliberate gesture. A claim of territory, perhaps, or maybe a warning. It sent a jolt of pure fear through me. I pulled my arm away, maybe a little too quickly, and just muttered, see ya," before practically jogging down the hallway. I know this all sounds crazy. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm jealous of Ben's happiness. Or maybe I'm just not good with new people. But this feels different. This feels wrong. Like she's wearing a human suit that doesn't quite fit. Like there's something ancient and cold and calculating hiding behind those pale eyes and that polite smile. I don't know what to do. I can't convince Ben that something is wrong. He's too deep in it. My parents are starting to notice the oddities, but they just attribute it to her being eccentric. They haven't seen the coldness, the detachment, the lack of humanity that I'm starting to see. I feel isolated. I feel like I'm the only one who sees it. And the more I see, the more afraid I become. This isn't just a weird girlfriend. This feels like something other. Something that has its sights set on my brother. And I have no idea how to protect him, or myself, from it. This is getting long, and I need to process all of this. I'll try to add more details as things happen, or as I remember more specific incidents. Has anyone ever dealt with someone like this? Someone who feels fundamentally wrong? Please tell me I'm not going crazy. The fear hasn't subsided. If anything, it's a constant hum beneath the surface of everything I do now. Since that incident at Ben's apartment when Sarah called him a valuable subject, my anxiety has been through the roof. Sleep offers little respite. My dreams are filled with pale eyes and cold touches. I keep replaying every weird interaction, every unnatural movement, every oddly phrased sentence. They feel less like isolated incidents and more like pieces of a terrifying puzzle I'm slowly, reluctantly putting together. Ben is definitely getting worse. Not just the physical cold he had, which lingered far longer than a normal cold should, but something else. He looks tired, even when he says he's gotten enough sleep. His usual easygoing nature is gone, replaced by a nervous energy and a defensiveness I've never seen. He snaps at me sometimes if I ask too many questions, even innocuous ones about his day. And he talks about Sarah constantly, but not in a way that sounds like a guy happily in love. It sounds more like an obsession, or like he's trying to convince himself how perfect she is. He's also started adopting some of her strange habits. I was over at his place briefly the other day to pick something up. Ben was sitting on the couch watching TV. But he wasn't really watching it. He was sitting perfectly still, with that same blank, unblinking stare Sarah uses. He wasn't reacting to the show at all, just sitting there like a statue. It was horrifying to see my vibrant, expressive brother mimicking her eerie stillness. When he finally noticed me, he blinked rapidly a few times like he was coming out of a trance and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Alex, didn't see you come in." "Yeah, just grabbing them." I trailed off looking at him. "You're okay, Ben, you seem spaced out." His smile tightened. "Fine, just tired. Long day." "Right," I said, not believing him for a second. "Listen, Ben, have you noticed anything different about yourself lately?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Different? What do you mean?" "I'm happy, Alex. Happier than I've been in a long time." He said it with too much intensity, too much forced cheerfulness. "I know you say you're happy," I pushed gently, "but you seem tired and quiet. You're not acting like yourself." He stood up abruptly. "Maybe this is myself now. Alex, maybe you just don't know me as well as you thought you did." His voice was sharp, defensive. It wasn't the Ben I knew speaking. It sounded rehearsed, like Sarah's conversation. He walked towards me, and as he got closer, I noticed something else. His skin looked pale, almost translucent in places, and his eyes looked duller, not as bright as they used to be. "Look," he said, his voice lowering slightly, but still with that edge. "Sarah makes me happy. She understands me in a way no one else ever has. You don't need to worry about me." "But I am worried, Ben." "That's why I'm saying this. This isn't you." He took a step back, his posture stiffening. It was Sarah's posture. "I think you should go, Alex." It hit me then, with sickening clarity. He wasn't just influenced by her. He was becoming like her. Or maybe she was slowly replacing him, or changing him into something else. I left, the conversation ringing in my ears. It was clear I couldn't reach him through direct confrontation anymore. He was too far gone, too deeply under her sway. I knew I had to find out more about Sarah, even if she had no digital footprint. There had to be something. I started thinking locally. Where would someone like her come from? What would her life have been like before meeting Ben? Ben said she'd moved here a couple of years ago. Where had she lived before? He didn't know, or wouldn't say. I spent hours scouring local news archives online, missing persons databases, anything I could think of, using different search terms, women fitting her general description who moved to the area around that time. Any odd incidents reported that might somehow connect to her. Nothing. It was like she materialized out of thin air. Then I had a thought. Ben had mentioned she worked from home, doing data analysis. Could I find anything about her employer? Ben didn't seem to know the company name, just that it was remote. I tried searching for remote data analysis companies, cross-referencing them with potential addresses in the area. Even though she worked from home, maybe a company headquarters existed. It was a needle in a haystack. Defeated, I decided to try a different angle. What if I tried to observe her directly, more closely, without Ben knowing? A couple of nights ago, I drove over to Ben's apartment building. It's a standard 3-story walk-up. His unit is on the second floor. I parked down the street, far enough away not to be noticeable, but close enough that I could see his windows. I felt like a total creep, sitting there in my car in the dark. But the alternative, doing nothing, felt even worse. I watched his windows for a long time. Lights were on inside. I saw Ben walk past the living room window a few times. I didn't see Sarah. This wasn't unusual. She often stayed in another room while Ben did things. Hours passed. It got late. The lights in Ben's apartment stayed on. This was weird. Ben usually went to bed by 1 p.m. on a weeknight. It was past 1 a.m. I was about to give up when I saw movement at the living room window. It was Sarah. She walked to the window and just stood there, looking out. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just scanning the street below with that familiar, unnerving gaze. She stayed there for a long time, perfectly still. It reminded me of a security camera panning slowly, except it was a person. A person who didn't seem to need sleep. As I watched, something truly disturbing happened. A small moth fluttered against the outside of the window, attracted by the light. Sarah's eyes locked onto it. Her head tilted slightly, just like a bird observing prey. Then, slowly, she raised one hand towards the window. Her fingers twitched slightly, and the moth stopped fluttering. It just clung to the glass, perfectly still. It was like she had frozen it with her gaze, or with some unseen force. She kept her hand raised, her fingers still, and her eyes fixed on the motionless moth for several minutes. There was an intensity in her gaze that went beyond mere observation. It felt hungry, analytical, yes, but also predatory. Then, just as slowly as she raised it, she lowered her hand. The moth remained still for another second. Then, suddenly began fluttering frantically against the glass again, as if released from an invisible hold. Sarah watched it for a moment longer, then turned and walked away from the window, disappearing back into the apartment. I sat there in my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt cold sweat on my back. She did something to that moth. I saw it. It wasn't a trick of the light, wasn't my imagination. She exerted some kind of control over it. What else could she control? Was that what she was doing to Ben? Controlling him, like the moth. And if she could do that to a living creature, what was she capable of? I couldn't stay there anymore. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I started my car and drove home. The image of the frozen moth and Sarah's predatory gaze burned into my mind. I didn't know what to do. I had seen something impossible. Something that confirmed my worst fears. Sarah wasn't just strange, she was something fundamentally other. Something with abilities that didn't belong in the natural world. I spent the next day in a state of near panic. I called Ben again, needing to hear his voice, needing to make sure he was okay. He sounded tired, but said he was fine. Sarah was there. I could hear her voice faintly in the background, saying something I couldn't make out. It sounded like static. I made a decision. I had to go over there. I had to see Ben, talk to him face to face. Try one last time to get through to him, or at least see for myself what state he was in. And maybe, just maybe, I could find something, in that apartment that would give me a clue about what Sarah is, or where she came from. I told Ben I was coming over that evening. He sounded hesitant, which was unusual, but eventually agreed. He said Sarah would be there. Of course. Walking up to his apartment door felt like walking into a trap. My hands were shaking as I raised my fist to knock. I half expected the door to open by itself, revealing Sarah standing there with that unnerving smile. Ben opened the door. He looked worse than I'd thought. His eyes were sunken, his skin even paler. He looked exhausted, almost gaunt. But he smiled a strained, unnatural smile. "Hey Alex, come on in." I stepped inside. The apartment felt cold. Despite the normal temperature setting on the thermostat, the air felt still, heavy. Sarah was sitting on the couch, in her usual perfect posture. She didn't stand up or greet me. She just turned her head and those pale eyes fixed on me as I entered. The polite, empty smile was there. But this time, I saw something else in her eyes. Something calculating. Something that recognized me as a problem. "Hello, Alex," she said, her voice soft and measured. "Sarah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I looked around the apartment as I walked in. Everything was meticulously neat, almost sterile. Too neat for Ben's place. On a small side table I saw a notebook. It was open. As I passed it, I caught a glimpse of what was written inside. It wasn't words. It was diagrams. Complex, intricate diagrams filled with symbols I didn't recognize. And beneath them, numbers. Lots of numbers. And some phrases that looked like technical jargon. One phrase caught my eye, written clearly at the top of a page. Subject 7, integration log. Subject 7. Ben. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't a relationship. It was an experiment. I must have made a sound, or maybe my expression changed. Because Sarah's head snapped towards the notebook. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Her polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, cold alarm. "Ben," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent tone I'd never heard before. "The log." Ben's head whipped around. He saw me looking at the notebook. His eyes went wide with panic. "Alex, don't," he yelled, lunging towards the table. But Sarah was faster, with a speed that was utterly inhuman. She was off the couch and at the table in an instant. Her hand shot out, closing over the notebook. As she grabbed it, her sleeve rode up slightly. And I saw it. On her forearm, just above her wrist. It wasn't skin. It was something else. Smooth, grayish, with faint lines that looked like seams or plating. Like artificial skin. My breath hitched. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on that glimpse of unnatural material. Sarah clutched the notebook to her chest, her chest rising and falling slightly faster than normal. The only sign of anything resembling distress. Her eyes, fixed on me, were no longer blank. They were filled with a cold, intense fury. Ben stood frozen for a second, looking between me and Sarah. The panic on his face was quickly replaced by something else, a fierce, protective glare directed at me. "Get out, Alex," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Now." "Ben, you don't understand. Look at what I saw," I pleaded, pointing towards Sarah. Sarah took a step towards me. the notebook still clutched in her hand. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with suppressed energy. Her eyes narrowed. "He is not your concern, Alex," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Your interference is undesirable." I was trapped. Ben was staring at me with hostility. Sarah was advancing. And I had just seen undeniable proof that she wasn't human, and that my brother was her subject. I knew I had to get out. But I also knew I couldn't leave Ben here. Not like this. As Sarah took another step, I saw her other arm move slightly. Not towards me, but towards Ben. A subtle gesture, almost a command. Ben's expression changed again. The hostility faded, replaced by that familiar, vacant look. He turned away from me, towards Sarah, his posture slumping slightly, looking completely compliant. Sarah's gaze was locked on me. "This unit's integration is proceeding," she said, her voice returning to its measured, chilling tone. "Further observation is not required. Disengage. Disengage." Like I was a faulty drone. The meaning was clear. I was a threat. And she was telling me in her own terrifying way to leave. Or else. I glanced at Ben. He was standing there looking completely passive. His eyes fixed on Sarah. He was gone. Lost to her. I backed towards the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah watched me, a terrible, knowing look in her pale eyes. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Leave," Sarah repeated, her voice barely a whisper. But it filled the room. "No." I turned the doorknob, pulled the door open, and practically fell out into the hallway. I slammed the door shut behind me and ran, not stopping until I was in my car and driving away from that building as fast as the speed limit allowed. I don't know what I just saw. I don't know what Sarah is. But I know she isn't human. And she has my brother, and she knows I know. I'm shaking as I write this. What do I do now? She's dangerous. And Ben. Ben is gone. Whatever she's doing to him, it's working. He chose her over me, over himself. I saw the log. Subject 7 integration log. She's integrating him into something. Changing him. And I think I just put myself in her crosshairs. I don't think she'll just let me disengage. A fleeing Ben's apartment was the most primal instinct I've ever followed. My mind was a jumble of terror. The chilling sight of that non-human skin on Sarah's arm. The glimpse of the Subject 7 integration log. Ben's vacant eyes and hostile words. It wasn't just fear for myself. It was a gut-wrenching horror at the realization that the brother I knew was gone, replaced or controlled by it. I drove home on autopilot, my hands clenched white on the steering wheel, my heart still hammering against my ribs. Every car behind me felt like it was following. Every shadow seemed to shift and lengthen. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, but I didn't feel safe inside my own home. The feeling of being watched, which had been a persistent anxiety, was now a certainty. Sarah knew I knew, and she had directly threatened my interference. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room, the blinds pulled tight, a kitchen knife clutched uselessly in my hand. My logical brain tried to reassert itself, telling me I was being ridiculous, that it was just a misunderstanding, that I was overreacting to a bad argument, and a weird glimpse of skin. Maybe a birthmark. A scar. But the cold dread in my gut, the memory of Sarah's utterly inhuman speed and her cold fury, and the words, Subject 7 and Integration Log, screamed the truth. She wasn't human, and she was doing something to my brother. What did she mean by integration? What was she integrating him into? The diagrams and numbers in that notebook. Were they charting his transformation? His assimilation? The thought was so monstrous, so sci-fi horror, that it felt impossible. But I had seen the proof. The next day was a blur of panic and indecision. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? My brother's girlfriend is an alien roboto monster who is turning him into a subject, and I saw fake skin on her arm. They'd think I was insane. I thought about calling my parents, but they only saw her as eccentric. How could I explain the horror witnessed without sounding completely unhinged? They'd just worry, or worse, try to intervene themselves and put themselves in danger. I was on my own. Ben was gone, and I was in danger. I tried calling Ben's phone multiple times that day. It went straight to voicemail. I texted him, trying to keep it casual at first, then pleading. No response. It was like he'd vanished. Or like Sarah had confiscated his phone. The silence was deafening. It confirmed my fears. He wasn't just mad at me, he was unreachable. That evening, things escalated. I was still holed up in my apartment, trying to think. There was a faint scratching sound at my front door. It was quiet, deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I froze, the knife back in my hand. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then, a soft, measured voice, barely audible through the thick door. Sarah's voice. Alex, we need to speak. My blood ran cold. How did she know where I lived? Ben must have told her, of course. But the way she found me, the scratching, it felt less like a normal visit and more like something waiting. I didn't respond. I just stood there, frozen, listening. Your presence is a disruption. Her voice continued, still soft, still devoid of normal human inflection. Continued disruption is inefficient. Not annoying. Not dangerous. Inefficient. Like I was a bug in a system. Open the access point. Alex, she said. Access point. Not door. I pressed myself against the wall, away from the door. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like it would explode. Silence again for a few moments. I could feel her presence on the other side of the door. A cold, waiting stillness. Then, the scratching started again. More insistent this time. And then, a low, unnatural scraping sound. Like something hard was being drawn along the wood of the door frame. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a key. It wasn't a tool I recognized. It sounded like something sharp was being used to test the barrier. Panic seized me. I didn't know what she was capable of, but the moth incident, the artificial skin, she wasn't playing by normal rules. This wasn't a jilted girlfriend showing up at the door. This was something else. I backed away from the door, scrambling towards my kitchen, towards the window. I had to get out. As I reached the kitchen, I heard a faint click from the direction of the front door. And then, The doorknob slowly, silently, began to turn. She wasn't just knocking. She was getting in. I didn't hesitate. I threw open the kitchen window, fumbling with the screen, tore it open, and scrambled out onto the small fire escape landing. I didn't even bother closing the window behind me. I scrambled down the metal steps, my movements clumsy and loud in the sudden silence. I hit the ground running, not looking back, not daring to see if she was at the window, watching me. I ran through the parking lot, past the dumpsters, out into the street. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and my legs ached, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that apartment. I ended up at a brightly lit 247 diner several towns over. I sat in a booth in the corner, nursing a cold coffee, trying to regain some semblance of control. I was a mess, shaking, sweating, breathing heavily. People stared, but I didn't care. As I sat there, the full weight of the situation crashed down on me. My brother was gone, potentially being fundamentally altered by this thing, and the thing knew I was a threat and was actively pursuing me. I was alone, with nowhere to go, no one who would believe me. I pulled out my phone, my hand still shaking. I had a dozen missed calls and texts. Some were from my parents, worried because they couldn't reach Ben or me. But one caught my eye. It was an unknown number. No caller ID. I hesitated for a long moment, then opened it. It was a text message. Just 3 words. Integration cannot be disrupted. No sender name. No way to reply. Just that chilling message sent directly to my phone. She wasn't just at my door. She was everywhere. She had my number. She knew where I was. Or maybe she didn't need to know in the conventional sense. Maybe she had other ways of finding people. My mind flashed back to the moth, frozen in midair. Her subtle control. Was she doing that to Ben on a massive scale? Controlling his thoughts, his actions, integrating him into what? A collective. A new form. I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't go to my parents' house. That would put them in danger. I was a fugitive in my own life. What about Ben? Could I save him? After seeing the log, seeing his vacant eyes, seeing her capability, I didn't know if there was anything left to save. She wasn't just influencing him, she was transforming him. And he seemed to be a willing participant, or perhaps no longer capable of not participating. The thought gnawed at Meg, what if Subject 7 wasn't the first? What if she, or things like her, had done this before? Was this an isolated incident, or was it part of a larger process? I didn't know the answers, and I was terrified of finding out. I stayed at the diner until dawn, watching the windows, jumping at every sound. I didn't feel safe anywhere. Sarah felt like a presence, a consciousness that could extend its reach far beyond physical proximity. I haven't contacted anyone since. I'm living off the grid as much as possible, staying in cheap motels far from home, paying cash, turning off my phone for hours at a time. Every time I turn it back on, I brace myself for another message. Another threat. I tried searching online again, but this time for anything. Anything that might relate to unnatural phenomena, strange disappearances, anything that echoed the horror I'd witnessed. I found forums dedicated to cryptids, conspiracy theories, unexplained events. Nothing specific to a Sarah or an integration log. But the sheer volume of stories about things that don't fit into the normal world only amplified my fear. It made me feel like I had stumbled into a reality far larger and more terrifying than I could comprehend. I check Ben's social media occasionally, under a fake name. There are no new posts. His profile picture, a photo of him smiling broadly, looks like it belongs to a ghost. My parents have posted worried messages asking if anyone has seen him. No one has. He's just gone, integrated. I don't know what Sarah is. I don't know her purpose. But I know she's here, or things like her are. And I know she took my brother. And she knows I'm still out here, a loose end. I feel her presence sometimes. A cold awareness at the edge of my perception. It's like she's patiently waiting, observing, knowing that eventually. Why? All variables are contained. All disruptions are eliminated. I don't know how long I can keep running. I don't know if there's anywhere safe left for me. I just know that the woman my brother fell in love with wasn't a woman at all. And whatever she is, it's still out there. And it knows my name. This is the last time I'll be posting. It's too risky. If she can send texts to my phone, she can probably track me through this account. I just wanted to get this out there in case something happens. In case someone else sees the pale eyes, the blank smile, the precise movements, and feels that same cold dread. Maybe my story can help someone else recognize the signs before it's too late. For now, I'm just trying to survive. Trying to stay one step ahead. Trying not to think about Ben or what he's become. And trying not to look out the window at night. Because I have a feeling, sooner or later, I'll see those pale eyes staring back.